If you're a sales leader, a CRO, vice president of sales, director of sales, or a frontline sales manager, you are in luck because today we're going to hear from one of the top sales leaders in America about the subject of process discipline. His name is Dino Perone, and Dino has spent almost 30 years as an executive sales leader. He's led sales teams at over $1 billion in revenue at AT&T for 25 years. And most recently with Spectrum, also a large sales team with over 800 salespeople, I think you told me, Dino. So thank you for joining the show today.
Well, thanks for having me, Bill. I'm excited. I mean, process discipline, or just the word discipline, right, probably strikes a chord with a lot of sales leaders, right or wrong. So it's a great topic to dive into and really unpack and see what we can get out of it.
Yeah, we're going to cover three things today as I want to talk about why sales process. What's the point of having one in the first place? Then we're going to talk about selling the process, what it is to actually champion this for your organization and drive adoption and accountability to it. And then thirdly, how do we make process work? And so let's jump into that first piece by really just talking about why do we need a sales process in the first place?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for airing this topic because I know it evokes a lot of emotion in both sellers and sales leadership.
It does.
But here's the why. Here's the why for me anyway, right? Sales process or any process is a plan.
Yeah.
It is a plan of attack that guides sellers, the organization to success. What successful sales organization doesn't have a plan?
Yeah, well, I be honest with you, I've met a lot of sales organizations that don't have a plan, and some of them are even, in fact, successful, or at least on paper. My question becomes, though, is could they be even more effective if they did have a standardized plan that people can follow? I think that sometimes markets rise and we're in the right place at the right time, but organizations that I see that have consistent growth over longer periods of time are those that have a process, that follow process, that stay disciplined and accountable to it.
Yeah. For sure. You can't count on luck, right? And so winging it is, there's the luck factor in that, and that happens in sales, right?
Yeah.
But process also allows the organization to not only sustain results, but to scale results, right?
Get results, yes,
bigger
sir.
results and bring in more revenue, right? Mm-hmm. So the process is fundamental, not only from a plan or here's the journey that's going to make us successful, right? But it also provides a platform to grow the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'd like to get into just a little bit about kind of how we establish process and then how we hold people accountable to process. And maybe we'll even, I want to also weave into that. How do you sell the process? And what I mean by that is, as a leader, how do you get other people interested in wanting to follow a procedure or some steps or some sort of standardized process that we'd like them to follow? So let's take it in any direction you want, really. We can start with, where do you come up with this, or how do you sell it? What do you want to start with here?
Yeah, well, a process, especially in sales or a customer-facing environment or organization, starts with how do we square off with customers in a differentiated way, right? And so the process ought to map to how we want to do that. And that's a collaborative effort across the senior leadership of any organization.
Yeah, right? So that's not just sales, that's marketing, that's product development, that's even executive leadership and every other aspect of the business. And I love that because so many times we get process somewhat inwardly focused. Here are the things that we're going to do to try to sell something. And as you're pointing out, it's got to be aligned with the things that our customers are doing to try to buy something. Am I right?
Right. And each part of the process, right, has to address all the channels that the organization is using to go to market, whether it's direct, indirect, digital, or any other channel for that matter. So it's not a one-size-fits-all process, right? It has to be distinct.
Yeah, this is interesting. So, I work with a lot of companies, even very large companies, that still don't really have much of a organized process for how do we go to market and how do we want people to engage with clients, et cetera. But when we do, or when they do, sometimes I see, okay, we've got our 6-step process or our 7-step process, and it seems like they think it is a one-size-fits-all. But to your point, depending on which channel it is, it's going to vary greatly. And I would say also based on customer type, because the way that some customers in, let's say, certain kinds of vertical markets, or whether we're talking to a publicly owned company versus privately held company versus a government agency, the buying process is very, very different. So I always encourage people to think about, look at how the different segments of your customer base buy, and then align your process or processes multiple to how those customers buy. Very true.
And it starts with, I think, good market data, right? And we depend on marketing predominantly to bring that information into the senior leadership team, right? So that we can make data-driven decisions on process for each one of those channels, right? So process is really a ground-up, collaborative approach that not only includes scripts, right, by channel, but it also includes the enabling technologies that each one of those channels ought to be using to accelerate the sales process.
Yeah, now that opens a big can right there, my friend, because technology is rapidly evolving in our world, and we'll probably end up talking about AI before we get to the end of this video.
Yeah,
but I don't want to rush too quick into that. So there is quite a bit of a prevalent thought, I think, in the marketplace today that I don't want to hire people that need sales training or need process. I want to hire people that already know how to sell. And so they'll probably come in with their own way of doing things. We're going to kind of cherry pick from our competitors and find the very best in the marketplace, overpay them, and bring them to our organization and just let them run. What are your thoughts about that? That's a very prevalent way of thinking these days. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's a great topic. Oftentimes we look to the best sellers, and best sellers are nothing more than what was your quota and how far above your quota did you achieve, right? So we'll go after a 200%er, and they're going to do the same thing for my organization, right?
At least that's the thought.
It doesn't work that way.
Tell us why.
Because each company has a differentiated product set, right? And number two, each company should have a different process that differentiates itself from its competitors. And so if the 200%er is not willing to learn either the new product set as well as the new process, they won't be successful, right? Their grit, their patience, their likability will only go so far, right? So it's super important to get folks into the organization that are hungry to learn, and more importantly, able to give feedback on the process. And I think that's another component that a lot of organizations may miss when designing process is you have to have a closed loop system. What I mean by that is sellers are at the crux of the point of attack, right, in front of customers. And if their process isn't working or could be improved, they've got to be able to have a mechanism to provide feedback, data points into the organization so that leaders can make decisions on funding and allocation of resources to improve the process, to accelerate results.
That's very interesting. So as I said, a lot of companies that I work with they decide at some point, we need a process. And so in some cases, they'll go out and actually license one from some kind of a company that says, here's the process you're going to use. In my opinion, that's not always the best way to go because one process doesn't fit all organizations. But even if they did put their own fingerprints on it, a lot of times it's something developed by a training department, an enablement department, operations, and now they kind of push that on the sales team to here are the steps we want you to follow. We're going to measure you on the following metrics through that. And we could care less about what you think of it. I like what you said about this closed loop feedback system because it has to work, as you said, at the point of attack. And if it doesn't, then something needs to change.
Right. Yeah. So the plan will only get you so far.
Yeah.
Right. And in this case, process equals plan.
Yeah.
Right. But you know what happens with the best laid out plans? We all do as leaders, right? And so it's super important that, number one, everyone understands the plan, the process, right? The journey, the guide that's going to make them successful.
Yeah.
But the plan also has to provide a mechanism for feedback. It also has to allow flexibility and empowerment. Yeah. And that's the selling point, right? That I suggest organizations and key leaders use, right? With their teams, right? With their sellers, right? If something isn't working for you, tell us why, right? Or if this part of the process only allows you to provide one price to the customer and nothing else, that doesn't allow flexibility, right? Or empowerment, right? So it's those key areas that I think we as leaders need to do a better job at designing and then seeking feedback and taking that feedback and incorporating it back into the process to make it better.
Yeah, this is so interesting because I'm doing a lot of work these days with leadership consulting and leadership development within organizations that, for whatever reason, after 20-something years of primarily doing sales skills, prospecting, negotiation skills, qualification, et cetera, most recently digital selling, after all those years, it seems that just naturally my clients are starting to ask me more for leadership development. And so when we put new processes and policies together in terms of how we lead an organization, I know that it's critical that we get buy-in from all the leaders, from company owner or the CEO through the vice presidents, directors, et cetera. Without that buy-in and letting people put their fingerprints on it, they're not going to use it. They're not going to follow it. They're probably just going to sit around and complain about it. I like what you're saying here, and that the sales process we're asking the frontline sellers to execute, they need some ability to have input on that as well, because we can't just push it on them. You and I know what happens. They're going to resist it, right? And they'll do everything they can to not follow this, but then pretend to you as the executive vice president that they did, something along those lines.
Yeah, and here's the worst case scenario. You have a seller, right, that isn't using the process and doesn't have results.
Yep.
Right? So now what are you left with as a sales leader, right? Is it a performance improvement plan? Well, okay, let's put this person on a training plan. Does he or she understand the process, the plan to begin with? Is it motivational? Is it behavioral? Right? It is worth the time up front to get buy-in, right? Not only from the leadership, but every leader, by the way, right? Not just select leaders, all sales leaders.
Nice, yes.
As well as the sales organization, the individuals. This is something that should be taught in whatever boot camp or orientation or onboarding that the organization has.
Funny you'd bring up the PIP, right? The performance improvement plan. This is something I'm often asked about. How do you use this effectively? How do you avoid when you put somebody on this plan that they just instantly start looking for a job, right? They quit working and they spend their whole day talking to recruiters. I was asked this at a conference just a few months ago, and I said, you know what, guys? I think that everybody ought to constantly be on a performance improvement plan. And they were kind of taken aback. It's like, wait, what? And I said, let's think about what this means, right? We're going to show people exactly what we want them to do. We're going to hold them accountable to doing those things, and we're going to measure the results they achieve when they do those things. Yeah. Why wouldn't we do that all the time? Why would we wait till somebody's failing to implement that kind of process?
We do this all the time, and it begins with the CEO, right? The CEO, they're infamous, right? Or the sales, they're infamous for saying, okay, you achieved 100% or 105% of plan. Why can't you do 110%?
Yes.
Right? You can always improve performance is my point, right? So the performance improvement plan, I think, begins with culture, right?
Ooh.
If it's a culture that's invested in people development versus waiting until failure, right? That is a leadership weakness, not
Mm.
a seller
Mm.
weakness, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you, as a sales leader, are waiting for the seller to fail and not proactively coaching,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then you fail the seller, not the other way around,
Wow.
right? So performance improvement plans should be a last resort.
Mm-hmm. That is phenomenal. The seller, we failed the seller, not the other way around. That is worth. I'm gonna tweet that tomorrow, and I'll put your name underneath it. Right?
Go ahead. Go
According
ahead.
to Dino Perone, that is really good, and I think that's very true. So a lot of organizations that I see right now are hiring rapidly, and it's this onboarding process that, to your point, I see that we might be failing some of these new people that are coming on board because we're not teaching a process, holding people accountable to a process, and measuring the results against a process the way we would at the point of failure, to your point. We should be doing that all along, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really, really good. So that gets into the idea then of scorecards and tracking and all the different pieces to this. Tell me, if you would please, as you look at a sales team and you're trying to sell the process, drive the process, hold people accountable to process, how do you as the leader proactively do that? What are you saying? What are you doing? What actions are you taking to try to drive process through the organization?
Sure. Well, you said it. It starts with what metrics am I looking at? And by the way, the metrics that I'm looking at my level, right, ought to be the same metrics that that frontline sales leader
Ooh,
is looking at, right? My
yes.
metrics aren't much different. They're really not,
Yep.
right? Because when I engage with the organization, leaders and sellers and partners, right? All the scorecards, right, or dashboards, right? We all should know what the metrics are,
Yeah.
what's important,
Yep.
right? And what's important at my level should be what's important at first line sales leader
Yeah.
level.
Yeah.
So that's how I start my discussions. It's like, let's look at the metrics, right? Let's see where we're falling short. Let's see where we're doing better, right? And let's get the feedback loop going,
Mm-hmm.
right? How can we improve these metrics, or what's stopping us from improving these metrics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the metrics are nothing more than a start point to have an engaging discussion with the organization, whether it be sellers in roundtables or sales leaders in weekly, monthly, quarterly reviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, probably 30 years ago, Dino, I heard on a cassette tape, like for those of you who can remember what a cassette tape was, I learned on a cassette tape a very important phrase that I have carried with me. I use it daily for myself, and I talk about it in workshops constantly. And here it is: where performance is measured, performance improves.
Yeah.
I love that. I live by it. I teach it, and it's universally true. But to your point, this is really interesting. Where performance is measured, if I'm the only one, if I'm the vice president of sales and I'm the only one that's looking at those numbers, it doesn't necessarily improve. Performance improves when you provide that feedback to the person who you're measuring so they can self-correct and that they can get better at something. I often say that a lot of people want to get better, and I would like to think anybody working on our teams, they'd like to get better. It's not always obvious what they need to get better at.
Yes.
So until we have some data, we don't know how to kind of self-correct and do better. But then I want to talk about this. You just said sit down and have a discussion. I have found that in sales organizations today, the lost art of talking to people has become a real problem, in that we want to just provide some kind of a dashboard for people to look at, or we're going to type what they need to do differently into some sort of an online system and mail it to them and expect them to change their behavior and do better. But I like the word you said, discussion. Talk to me about discussions you have at your level and how that works its way down through the organization.
Yeah, well, it's the difference. in leadership style, I think, right?
Okay.
If you're a leader that looks at dashboards and emails people in the organization on why aren't you hitting these metrics and why aren't you hitting these numbers, versus having a live discussion on the subject, right? Either the challenge or the opportunity, either in person, then I prefer the latter.
Yes.
Right? That's my leadership style.
Yeah.
And you're going to learn a lot more, right? You're going to learn a lot more in the sales environment, right? We're in front of customers.
Yes.
Customers have nonverbal cues, right? As well as verbal cues, right? And being live on the ground in the trenches with sellers and sales leaders, you get a different response, right?
Yes.
And so the numbers just don't tell the story, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of other subjective data that I think sales leaders need to form a picture,
Yeah.
a completer picture.
This is so good. So what you're describing is going to benefit the seller, or you might be sitting down with a sales manager, right? As a leader, you might be sitting down with anybody in the organization. But the conversation is going to benefit them more. They're going to understand more about your heart and why you're asking them to change and do things differently. But then also, we're going to get more out of it. I love that, because we're going to get the feedback and a better understanding about how to help them to get better. I really do think that those who read a dashboard and type what we want people to do different, or worse, just type that, hey, you're falling short, you need to correct this, that's not really leadership to me. I could literally create an AI tool that would scan this and would send an email telling them you need to do more of this and do more of that and do less of that. But does that help anybody, really?
No, because most sellers know that already.
Right.
They are smart. And so don't insult their intelligence. Don't do that.
That's a great point. So then let's take one more scenario, sir. Let's take one more scenario. Let's imagine that I'm a seller on your team, and I am, let's say I'm doing okay. I'm putting up some numbers. Maybe I'm not blowing it out at 150%, but I'm hitting quota sometimes, and I'm getting to 90% other times. And so I'm not your worst problem on the team. But I kind of got my own way of doing stuff. And I don't want to report things. And I don't really want to talk about things. I want to do it my own way. Why should I conform or adopt process if I'm kind of already doing okay?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons, right? So first of all, sellers who are in the top tier consistently, right, they may have found a way, right? But I would say to those sellers and sales leaders that are managing and leading those individuals, right, you have to get the ego out of the way, right? And here's why. Number one, those top performers, yes, are posting big numbers, but the rest of your sellers are looking to that individual, right, as a role model.
Yes.
And if that individual isn't following the process, right, or worse, not sharing his or her knowledge, right, then I'm not sure that they're a top performer other than numbers.
Wow, that's interesting. What would you say then to someone who isn't sharing their knowledge or their success? How would you sell this to persuade them to behave and think a little bit differently?
Yeah, well, number one, you have to have a live discussion. This isn't over email.
Right.
Right?
For sure.
And it can be had during a coaching discussion or performance review, and maybe just a general review, right, on numbers. But the whole point, right, is you got to share your knowledge, right, for those that are new to the organization. But number two, if you did use the process, would you be even better, right? Would you be able to serve more customers, increase revenues, increase compensation, right? And make the organization better, right? that is a sit-down, face-to-face discussion, in my opinion, right? And I've seen too many sales leaders don't want to have that discussion with the top performer because it'll scare them off, or, oh, my boss is coming down on me. My results are good, right? If not great. Why am I, having this maybe awkward discussion? You got to have that discussion. That's the only way we'll improve the organization, is by having those frank discussions with top performers as well as bottom performers.
Yeah.
Everyone needs development and coaching. And with the introduction of AI as a multiplier, right? You as a leader coach, right, should be better, right? You should be a better coach with that capability, right? But right now, AI only proves to take various data points, right, that are pretty much objective, right, metrics off the dashboard, right, and present them for discussion. What the coach, though, the leader coach, right, ought to have as another data point is actual observation of that seller, whether poor performing, high performing, and everyone in between, right? The subjective observation is extremely important, which means you have to be an engaged leader. You can't lead from behind the screen.
That's so good. Well, Dino, I sure appreciate you coming on the show. Your knowledge and your experiences is really something. And so I hope that a lot of our viewers and listeners have really benefited from this. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Have a great day.
Appreciate you. Take care, sir.